Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's good to see new new faces and old friends. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Jeff O'Keefe. I'm the Executive Director of Zen Peacemakers, and I am just really delighted and pleased that we have our friends Jared Seide from the Center for Counsel and Roshi Marko, who are joining us to lead in a discussion uh, which they've titled Leaving Prison Behind, a Counsel Before I Go. And Jared's organization, in fact, while we were waiting, we were talking about incarceration in the United States and the challenges of people reintegrating back into post prison life. So I'm looking forward to their sharing about this topic today, and I thank you all for being here and welcome. And with that, Jared, I think maybe I'll should I hand to you or Eve? Who would like to begin?
If you hand to me, I'll probably hand it to Eve. So
Well,
that would be fair.
we can play catch. So I'll hand it to you, and you can decide how you want to go.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, Jeff and Eve. I can't tell you how excited I am to just continue the conversation with you and be with you. So I'll defer to you and thank you so much for sort of hosting this and leading this discussion.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for, well, not just for your work, but also for this wonderful book. This workshop was titled, as Jeff said, Leaving Prison Behind, a Counsel Before I Go, because that's the book. That's the name of the book that Jared put out in the Center for Counsel. And it was so inspiring to me when I got it that I said, oh boy, we really got to do more to talk about this and all the work that this represents. So, what I just thought I would do, Jared, is just say something about counsel and say something personal about it. And that is that I'm a longtime member of Zen communities since 1985, which, as some of you may know, tend towards silence. Sitting meditation, quiet meditation, silent meditation. And one day in 1997, we were introduced to a practice called counsel, which was a talking practice, talking in the zendo, literally, not outside in the waiting room or in someplace else, but literally in the zendo. And like some people, I felt a lot of resistance to it. A, I wanted silence. And B, if there was going to be talk, I like to do most of it. So it must have taken me about a good year to, well, not just train, the training goes on and on over many years, but just to begin to appreciate the wonders of not just listening, really appreciating finally how little I was listening. Counsel showed me that, how little I listened. And also what happens when your talk changes and the quality of your speech changes and what it is you talk about and the layers of stuff that you go through just that are finally pierced and something really clear and pure comes from the heart and is expressed to everybody else. And I really loved it then. But what's amazing is that we started counsel regularly in 97, the Zen Peacemakers, and then it just spread like wildfire all around the Zen world, both here in the United States and also in Europe. It just went crazy. It's as if all these centers that have been so silent for so long just were dying to talk and share and speak from the heart. So that was really something. And and that's when all these connections began. And integrating counsel into all the bearing witness retreats that Zen Peacemakers does, as Jared well knows, because he's been in a few and he's trained facilitators at Auschwitz-Birkenau. So, Jared, let me ask you, since I just shared my initial contact with counsel, would you say how you came across it and how it affected you? And it affected you obviously so deeply that, well, that here we are so many years later. Would you say something about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you for that, Eva. It's a pleasure to be in such a rich lineage, and just to say that the pervasiveness of this practice throughout Zen communities is mirrored by contemplative Christian communities, Muslim communities, Native American communities, all kinds of different sort of spiritual formation has, I think, been craving for an opportunity to not only bear witness, but to engage and to find a way to be in compassionate communication and speech, to extend the work, the good work, into the world. I grew up in New York. New York was a very different place when I grew up in it. It was gritty, it was exciting, it was sketchy, it was intimate and loud and honest, and it felt very much alive with the stories of people. You couldn't avoid it. And I kind of left that after having grown up there, and I said, kind of had a sense of how important it was to really listen in to the people you're with. And in California, I think I found less and less opportunity to do that. And it felt kind of isolating. I was somebody who was a child actor. I had been in the theater and been doing some TV stuff and wanted to come out to California to sort of be in the authentic storytelling that I had found to be so compelling. Hollywood did not do that for me. I have to say it was not a place to pursue authenticity in storytelling. So I was frustrated to be in California, craving that kind of magical ability to find a character inside a story, and had a daughter who was in a public school that was falling apart. It was post Rodney King riots, and public schools were tough places. And there was bullying and there was aggression and parents didn't get along. And there was a sense of like, this is not a good place to be. And as I was president of the governing board at the time, and felt like this community needs to find some way to get its act together, or I can't leave my daughter here. And we had heard that people were experimenting with this practice of coming together and telling their story and listening to one another. And I thought it might be something that would be an interesting thing to try as a sort of a last resort. And when we brought the practice of counsel to the open charter school in Inglewood, California, something sort of miraculous happened. There was this turning away from everything we were arguing about and turning towards love of the kids and wanting to see the next generation get along with one another and bringing nourishment. There was something so incredible about letting all that stuff down and just showing up as humans who cared about our kids. And the impact, the transformation of this communal practice on that place was so amazing to me. But not only as a parent, watching the teachers find ways to bring real authenticity into the classroom, asking the children, the 8, 9, 10-year-olds, to find the story, to find their voice, watching my daughter sort of come into insight about the people she was interacting with. And she sort of became a writer in that moment, understanding how stories worked with one another. It was an incredible thing to see in my daughter, and she sort of became my teacher in understanding this is a really important practice, not just in a school, but everywhere. And I kind of dropped the whole entertainment industry thing and realized I could do this. I had an opportunity opening up in front of me to see that not only schools, but community-based organizations and businesses, and this issue of folks who are being thrown into prison. At the time we were talking about this, our prisons in California were overcrowded almost doubly at double capacity, 175,000 folks or something, and prisons built for about 100,000. It was an atrocious situation, and the Supreme Court had decided that it was cruel and unusual punishment for folks to sit in those places and ordered California to do something about this. You can't just hold people and assume that, they're just going to sit there forever and die. There needs to be some way to remember our duty to, at the end of their sentence, when they've paid their debt to society, find a way for them to come home. And the bureaucracies couldn't really get on top of that. They reached out to community-based organizations, and I was able to kind of bring something that we knew, working with schools and community-based organizations and groups of people who wanted to find a way to cooperate, to value diversity, to bring that into prisons as part of this effort to remember what rehabilitation was. And that sort of started our work in utilizing this practice of counsel and speaking and listening from the heart to help folks come home from prison. This program started with a single prison where we got a chance to do this, and quickly there were 3 and then 6 and then 12 and now 29 prisons with thousands and thousands of folks who are incarcerated, craving this opportunity to remember who they are and to find a way to recover that humanity so that they can make the journey home in a good way and not just get stuck there. They didn't accept the fact that this was it. This was the end of the line. And so we found a really receptive audience there, and that just led to all kinds of other wonderful work we were able to do, helping folks find the skillful means of recovering their authentic voice, and doing that in the company of a community of practice that was just there to listen from the heart and offer regard. You're muted.
Let me ask you something, Jared. Last night I saw a long interview of Gabor, the trauma specialist, Dr. Gabor Mate, and he said it's important for people not to look at others and say what's wrong with them, but to say what happened to them. So when you started your work in prisons and you gave people an opportunity to tell their stories to their peers, yet you encountered resistance, right? Not everybody in the, in the prison system just jumps into counsel. Could you talk about about the resistance you encountered from inmates? But also, I think it's a very relevant issue to us, people who've never been to prison. What resistance do we have to sitting in a circle and sharing what our story is? Why do so many of us not want to do that? And before I give you the mic, I want to say to everyone, rather than waiting for the end for comments and questions, we thought it would be more interesting that if you have a question or comment, please don't wait till the end. Raise your electronic hand, I think under show reactions. If you do that, am I right, Jeff? You have the option to kind of raise your hand. So if you have a question or if you have a comment or something you want to add, even now, please feel free to do that, and we'll call on you, because we want to get your ingredients also, not just Jared's rich menu of ingredients. I think it would make all this meal much richer. So, resistance, Jared, what's your experience with that?
Oh, goodness, Eve, thank you for all of that. I don't know that I have the ingredients, but I feel like I'm a good Instacart shopper for maybe making some connections to folks who have the ingredients. And I know that I can see even in our call, we have some of our good friends and allies who were along for this journey from the inside. And I would also say that it wasn't that I brought anything to anyone that they didn't already have. When we initiate a practice of coming together and creating Sangha, creating opportunity to be with others in a heart-based way, to practice together, letting go of what we think we know and bearing witness, some extraordinary things emerge. And as we shared the practice with folks inside, there was just an incredible richness and a kind of a generativity that emerged in this work. There is a lot to say about resistance. The reception inside prison does not meet with a lot of resistance from those who are craving this. They are so longing for an opportunity to recover these stories. But it's very difficult to get there because the culture inside prisons is not one that encourages vulnerability or softness or talking about, things that are uncomfortable. You are constantly on guard, and there are some very important rules that you better follow. We had a conversation this last weekend about how, people don't understand. It's like the 1950s in a lot of ways as far as race. And, when you're in a prison setting, at least in California, there are places where white people don't go, where Black people don't go, where Northern or Southern Mexicans can't go. You can't eat in a certain place. You can't speak with certain folks. There are things that are understood about who you are and who others are that are the rules of the road. And you break those rules at your peril. And there's often all kinds of violent repercussions if you don't buy into these ideas about what it means to be who you have identified as in a prison setting. And so the thought that we would be authentic and we would be vulnerable in that setting just seems counterintuitive. And yet, when that is taken away from us, there's a sense that we're not complete humans. When someone takes away our identity and our best friends growing up who happen to not be, politically correct to hang out with on the yard, and someone takes away our softer sides, our ability to function in a way that maybe it doesn't conform with what is expected in prison, there's a real loss. I think folks walk around with a sense of being less than their full human identities. And so recovering that in counsel is an extraordinary thing to see. We offer folks the opportunity to step into this group, and often there's a lot of question like, well, who's going to be there and can I sign up? And often up into the first moment where someone walks into that room and sees, oh gosh, he's here and he's here, and that's an adversary and that's an enemy, and I'm beefing with that guy. Can I even sit in this room? There's a sense of like, okay, I'll wait and see. When the first story happens and somebody describes something that happened in their life, and you realize, well, that was unexpected. that kind of happened to me, right? That seems strangely familiar. All of a sudden, all of that begins to dissolve, all that resistance and all that sense of, we are so different. Our experience is such that there's nothing that you can say that is going to touch me disappears. It's proven to be false. And we begin to realize that we have so much that we share. The initial counsel programs that or initially when we offer a counsel program, I should say, we get signups. We have about 20, 25 folks that get that volunteer and that get admitted to a group. What we saw was word of mouth immediately start spreading. And so by the time we would come back a few weeks later, there were 200, 250 people on the waiting list to get into this group. There was something happening there that was so compelling that consistently folks felt, gosh, I got to get that guy, I got to get my cellmate, I have to get this, this person really needs this. And then there was a sense of like, how do I get into this group? How do I have an opportunity to do this? And so whatever initial resistance was there dissolved as far as working with folks inside prisons. And it's not to say everybody wants to do this. There are a lot of folks who are just not ready to have this conversation, but there is such a craving for this kind of nourishment. It's an extraordinary thing to say. And having said that, we've normalized really dysfunctional ways of being. We've normalized, denying parts of ourselves. It's very uncomfortable to let go of those things that we have always kind of fronted with. We've always, kind of believed. And when we really examine, when we set aside what we think we know, and we allow ourselves to speak what's really going on, what's coming up authentically in this moment, and to listen in a way that, is not about, well, I know what you're going to say, I know who you are, but to remain curious enough to hear somebody you don't expect to say something that's going to resonate, say something that sort of knocks your socks off. It's really an extraordinary experience, and it's very unsettling. And that kind of unsettling experience is not for everyone. Some folks are very comfortable with the positions they found themselves in and the roles they play. I think that coping mechanisms that have evolved around this is who I am and this is what I do are important for survival, certainly inside prisons, and letting that down is not easy. And there's also a sense, I'll have to say, that this is some kind of weird woo-woo voodoo, like supernatural, like what is this? It's like, I'm a Christian and you guys got like a candle and you're like all getting silent. Like, what, how can I do? I mean, I'm not going to give up who I am and my whole sort of spiritual sort of identity to be in some ritual that is, we kind of laugh at it at this point. It's like some kind of like, you got like a Ouija board out there, some kind of seance you're doing is always sort of the joke. And then folks kind of sit into it and realize it's really just getting quiet and telling your story, and that dissolves. But I have to say that as anyone who's worked in the mindfulness world realizes, there's a lot of sense that this must be anti-Christian, this must be anti, something. And so therefore I can't participate. And that's a source of some resistance as well. And then finally, I'll just say, Eve, that what you said at the very beginning, I think is very real. We often enter a conversation because we have something to say, and we're not so interested in listening. We really want to just use our communication with an agenda because I want to convince you, I want to seduce you, I want to intimidate you, I want to get something across. And so when I speak, it is intentional. And when you start speaking, I'm just going to be planning the next thing I want to say. So this is really not prioritizing how we bear witness to one another. It's really a learned behavior in communication that is sometimes important to break folks of. And so the ritual, the intentions of counsel really just simply ask us to think about how it is we're listening and how it is we're speaking, and preference curiosity and open-mindedness and open-heartedness, like we might listen to nature or listen to cows in a meadow or the sound of the waves, as opposed to, oh, that person going on again. And similarly, that when we speak, we might say what's alive as opposed to that thing we always say. And it's a simple practice that's not easy to do. And there's a lot of sense of, this is going to be different for me, and how can I do this? So I appreciate the question. And, the resistance that we find is not specific or unique to prison, for sure. You see Jeff has his hand up.
Just before Jeff, I noticed that you got an inquiry on the chat from Lisa Darcy.
That's what I was going to mention.
Yeah, about what to do afterwards with people who've come out of prison. And I know you have something around that, but can we get to that a little later, because we're still talking about some other basic things. But Lisa, we will get to that question, okay? Because it's an important question, for sure. So let's, again, this interesting thing about opening ourselves up. I'm thinking about myself, and I come from a Holocaust survivor family with this heroic mother. And, if I was to say, I would say that my conditioning from babyhood was to be very tough and strong, independent, and not show weakness. Because if you showed weakness, you were dead. That's the world she came from. And she really was like that to the very end of her life. And I took that in also. That's my story, okay? So, it takes a long time till you see what's preventing you from opening up, really opening up and saying, wow, I could use help, or wow, I wish I had somebody, to back me up or support me, or it's hard. When you do these, and of course you have been, I've trained in counsel with you, Jared, and others have, and so not just prison, but I think even outside, but especially in prison, when you first start these circles, how long does it take till someone finally tells their story? Till someone finally has enough trust you said once this first person start, it's like, wow, people saying, wow, this is possible. But how long does it take till that first person starts? And there's this silence, what happens then?
I think the reason we train is that skillful facilitation makes that really easy. Because if I ask you to tell a story about your name, or the breakfast you had this morning and how breakfast has changed, or a favorite dessert, or some TV show you used to love, there are ways we can move towards the story that share a little bit of who we are, that are not your deepest, darkest. And let's talk about our scars. This is an opportunity for us to share something about ourselves and to be authentic, while also being appropriate. And I think while we have worked in prison, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about our work in schools and our work in organizations and in tech firms, our work with law enforcement, which has been extraordinary, and situations in which counsel is not some kind of magical wonderland where everything goes away and all of a sudden and there's no repercussions to saying anything, so just go for it. That's not reality. It can't be reality. When you're a teacher and you have seventh graders, there's an appropriate story to tell that can be authentic, and there's an inappropriate story to tell. And you need to know that part of the telling of your story that will engender trust, to offer what we call a belonging cue, this sort of vulnerability loop that emerges, has to do with knowing the room you're in, paying attention, not sort of getting swept up into this sense of now I can say anything, but having a facilitator invite you to bring something very simple from your life begins this process of, I'll tell you a little bit about, how I, people say my name incorrectly, except if they're in New York. So when you say Jared, hey, Jared, how are you, Jared? Then I know that you know me. And then when you go to California and they call me Jared or something, it's like, that's not who I am. And just sharing something about my name or something about, where I live or a pet I grew up with is going to give you a sense that you know a little bit more about me, and maybe give you an opportunity to tell a little bit more about you. So I don't actually experience that there's a lot of sort of folks feeling like, I can't go there, if you have skillful facilitation. And of course, there's not always skillful facilitation, and folks sometimes find themselves in over their heads quickly. One of the great things to remember is to initiate in celebration, to, something fun as a first round is always a good idea to break the ice, as opposed to going to the deepest, darkest. It'll come. People will talk about the things that are up for them, that are bothering them. But the opportunity to just begin to speak of who you are, that goes a little bit further than you usually do, starts that process. And I again, I see my friend Mitch over here. There's a whole lot of things that happen in people's lives, typically, who wind up populating the prisons, that involve adverse childhood experiences and all kinds of trauma and neglect and things that tend to be typical in that environment. So folks are carrying an awful lot. And have learned how to cope, learned how to show up. And so much of that needs to be unpacked. You need to kind of think about the things that you were taught and whether they're really serving you. And you begin to question that when folks start telling stories. The idea of what it means to consider toxic masculinity in prisons is a really important thing to understand. Men in prisons, and it's mostly men, use communication to intimidate and to push away and to, manipulate situations in a way that will keep them safe. And that typically is not the most inviting and sensitive way to communicate. And it has kept a lot of folks alive, and it has helped folks navigate the environment in the prison. But the thought of speaking that way and acting that way when you get out with your partner and your kids and toddlers and people at Ralph's shopping or wherever you do your shopping, the things you need to do to understand how you have been speaking that won't work when you get out. And one of the things that, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do this, one of the things I've wanted to do for years, and finally last year we got funding to do, was to create a reentry program so that everybody coming out of prison, and there are a lot of folks coming out of prison to the Los Angeles area, land in a council and have folks who are willing to show up on the outside as they did on the inside and really hold this sort of space for navigating how things are changing and how we are adapting. And so this reentry program, bridging to the programs we're doing within the community-based organizations, has been really critical for the continuation of this process that for many is happening for the first time, in the midst of their incarceration, remarkably. The first time they've actually been asked to tell a story from their life with other adults who actually care to listen is happening with a bunch of, folks who, are stabbing each other, regularly, and who committed crimes and who have all kinds of beefs with each other. You've found on Tuesdays between 6 and 8 p.m. a community of practice where folks are actually agreeing to set aside everything they think they know and offer regard and bear witness. And that experience is so extraordinary. In the book, the book begins with folks in the council in prison. And the guy who's leading that is a character named Big Ed, who's based on a real person who we knew, who was an extraordinary human being, sort of gentle giant, larger than life guy. And he came out along with everybody who was in that group, who were incarcerated, who had life sentences, and all of them worked together in council. And a few years later, 100% of that group got parole and came home. And so he would tell his story, and he would talk about what it meant to just get still and to just set aside everything that we had. In fact, this will be quick, but I want to just read this one piece because it's his words, and everyone should know that.
Wait, Jared, could you speak slower? We have a few people here who English is not their first language.
Thank you for reminding me.
So it would help me, it would help everyone and you're saying some really good things, so I'd like it if you spoke a little slower.
Thank you for the reminder, Eve. The book is made up of things that real people said or that came through letters and interviews we did. Everything in here is folks talking about their experience. And Big Ed had this incredible revelation. It's in the book. He says, getting really still and quiet, it started to feel like we were surrounded by truth and heart and trust. There's a spirituality about it, and it helps you want to think right and want to be good. And there's a truth that comes through. It's like it rings a bell inside you. And in understanding what the third tenet helps us remember, that compassionate action arises hearing the stories of individuals who have had this experience that when you set aside all of that and you truly show up and listen from the heart, something changes. Something starts to open in you, and you're compelled to want to do something to ease suffering of others, suffering in yourself. Some innate human goodness arises from the practice. And that has been so striking and beautiful to witness. And I will say that it happens over and over again. And in 29 prisons that we visit, we see it over and over again. And in this prison where Big Ed and some others were sitting in these councils, years later, I went back to that prison, Ironwood prison, and I sat in a group of some individuals who were offering counsel to me. And it was a beautiful counsel. And I asked them about where they had learned to do counsel. And they told me that they had been taught by guys who were taught by guys who were taught by the people we did the original counsel training with. So this had been 3 or 4 generations of folks who had felt so nourished by this practice that they had sustained it, even without grant funding for us to come in there. And that was such a beautiful affirmation of how resilient the practice is and how beneficial it is. And it's really not about us.
There have been a couple of inquiries and in the chat about how you can get the book, and you have a couple of answers. And I see that someone put also in that you can also donate when you get the book. And I'm so glad, Sydney Scanlon, that you put that in because A, it's a terrific book, and B, as you can hear, the Center for Counsel does wonderful work. I want to talk more also about your programs for police and prison guards and so on, but I don't want to lose the question that Lisa Darcy put out. So Lisa, why don't you ask your question yourself directly? Please unmute and do that.
Mahalo and good morning, everyone. It's nice to see your faces. I've followed you on emails for quite some time. So I shouldn't say followed. I've walked with you in emails for a very long time. I'm working with a group here locally, and just a little context is I've had the opportunity to train at UPIA for their chaplaincy program for a year. And locally, I met Kai, who is working with the Folsom Prison Project. And I'm not sure if you're aware of the work that he's done. And so he's one of our male mentor leaders. I am the women's coordinator. And holding this space is probably the most enriching experience in my personally of my life. And the training of holding circle is probably the richest experience in listening, as you expressed. So thank you. It's really nice to hear that from people who are doing this all over when you get in your own little space, and to expand it out again today. So thank you. It's such a complex, this is such a complex system. And we as individuals, I always say, are complex until we get in the way, and then we're complicated. And so I'm really trying to create this circle on the outside, this space. I don't actually think the technical part of it's going to be difficult, because the women really want it, the men really want it. What I want to make sure I honor is holding the same openness and awareness to the vulnerability of the individual. When people just come in and then go back to their cell or their dorms, you know, we talk about crossing the threshold of the door and having to go back into the space of all of these rules and rituals, which can be very unhealthy. And so when people get on the outs and when they're released, I just want to, have you have any experience with being sensitive to some of the needs or the structure for a facilitator to prepare for, in helping them to honor that awareness and that vulnerability within themselves? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful question and a beautiful awareness, and it is truly complex. What we are asking folks to do to actually survive inside prisons is in many cases making them more full of rage and anger and less able to cope. And so just the experience of incarceration often can create conditions that make it more difficult to re-enter society. And re-entry programs, I think, are multifaceted, must include case management for folks to be able to access resources that, you know, those of us who have our smartphones and are, you know, kind of good to go with our technology forward world, we just take for granted how overwhelming it is to come out and feel that there are resources that you can actually understand how to access, needs to be navigated by folks who are providing real case management, in addition to whatever parole agents and other you know, folks you need to report to. So there are technical resources that must be provided outside of this circle. It's really important to understand that having an agenda for a circle like council often is where we get tripped up. The unagendaed space, the space where we're really able to show up and be with what's arising, is so valuable in tandem with real practical resources that are provided in a really customized fashion to individuals. And hopefully there are those resources available. For us, having a case manager was critical. We could not do these reentry councils without somebody who was really navigating individuals on a one-to-one basis through the morass of what it is they need just to be able to take public transportation and receive their, you know, support checks and, you know, navigate their substance abuse issues in a good way and deal with the anger management issues and, you know, very other practical things that obviously need to happen. The idea of a warm handoff is something we've been talking about with the state of California. Leaving prison begins a lot earlier than actually getting outside the gate. And so understanding how we can reach into folks who are reaching the end of their incarceration and provide them with resources. This book was an attempt to do that, so that while they may be beginning to work with things that are going to open up in them consideration of important ideas, they're really rehearsing what it will be to be with their partner, their children, their elders. And frankly, we received incredible correspondence from folks inside who said, when COVID happened and I couldn't sit with the brothers in council, I just imagined them being around me in my cell. And I started to think about what it is they might be saying to me. And then I imagined my son coming and sitting with me. And then I imagined, my ancestors coming. And so the rehearsal of this and the imaginal counsel they were able to create for themselves because they had a grounding in the practice was such a resource that it sort of framed our book, Leaving Prison Behind, which is arranged around an individual who creates for himself a council of those he needs to hear from, who can mirror to him the things that he needs to be exploring prior to actually getting out of prison. When that can also be met by a supportive circle where you can actually show up and be with what is arising, that is such an important piece, but it's not the entire process. You can't affect all of this with a counsel on the outside if it hasn't begun before, and if it is not surrounded by resources that individuals will need, which are pressing, just about getting through the day-to-day tasks of life. So we're grateful. And again, we only do this because we have been successful with grants and with donors. And because we can raise enough money, we can do things like hire a case manager and create an opportunity to go inside prisons. And so thank you to everybody who wants to make a donation and get a copy of the book. It was intended for folks inside, but I think it's also valuable to many of us. And supporting the organization begins a conversation where we love to share with you what it is we're doing. It's a complex story, but it's also a very human story. And I'm just recognizing that my friend Mitch has raised his hand over here. Maybe his contribution at this point would be interesting from his unique perspective.
Where are you, Mitch? Whoops.
I am here.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. The actual situation is super complex, especially being mindful of maybe thinking of someone who has been incarcerated for 25 years, 20 years, 30 years, and think about just a simple thing as your phone. And there was no internet when a lot of these older inmates went in, and now they're coming home to a life that is completely different, very Jetsons-like, if you will. And it's fast. So I think what we do as far as when we work with individuals while they are inside, I think it's critical that we hold these circles in a space to kind of create the vulnerability for a lot of these guys who have been caged. And it's not just their body being caged, but it's also their emotions, their spirituality. Everything is being caged to a system of, for lack of a better word, brutality. It's very machismo. It's very controversial. And I'll just speak for myself. When you live by those laws that keep you alive, it's very hard when you come home and think, like, when someone acts a certain way, like my mind goes straight to, like, what would happen to you if I were in prison? And like, those are the things that counsel really helped me bring, like, a face to humanity rather than like a perpetrator against me or an enemy. Someone that can say something to me and have an opinion, and it doesn't mean that like it needs to go to a more extreme place. They're allowed to have their opinion. But those are things that like were softened for me while I was in counsel. Like race was a big thing. Issues with officers and authority were a huge thing. And all these things stemmed, what I learned through counsel was like a lot of these things stemmed from my relationship with my dad, and not just my dad in general, but like what he represented, which was that authority. Then I get incarcerated, and now there's people in green expressing themselves with authority. And it wasn't necessarily that I didn't like the cops. It was the fact that I don't like your authority, and that's what was triggering me. It wasn't that they were trying to do their job. It was like, you're telling me what to do. So all of that compounded with years of work and sitting in circles. And I do want to go back to the beginning of where, like, I was the first guy to go to, I don't know if I was the first guy, but I was definitely a guy that went to Jared and was like, yo, this is some, excuse my language, but like, this is some voodoo shit. And like, what is this, you know? And like, that was like my first exchange with Jared when I met him. I was like, dude, you got like all these ceremonial things in the middle. I was like, dude, this is a lot. Like, this is a lot. What do you think you're doing bringing this into a prison? Like, but I did tell him, because I was at a place in my own journey where I was like, look, I need to, like, I know I'm giving you a hard time, but I'm going to be open with you and I'm going to be vulnerable in this space. And it was really powerful to see a group of different races and a group of really enemies, to be honest, and to see the power of one person kind of making that leap of getting vulnerable and watching the domino effect around the circle, where like it was super powerful, where I always, like, when I'm done with a council, I always feel like euphoric. I feel like as if like, I say this a lot, but like when people are sharing their story, they're putting a piece of their trauma in the middle and allowing others to take the burden with that trauma, as opposed to me carrying it by myself. And that what I've found is like, it's a lot easier to carry someone else's trauma than your own. So that's the power of the circle. But yeah, like overall, I think we are a long way away from where we need to be. But as far as helping people transition with years and years of incarceration into a community where, and to be honest, like, they're also being paroled to places that are high violent, high poverty, high homelessness, high drug use. Like, it's not like they're being paroled to a place where they have optimal success. They're being paroled to a very high relapse environment. So it's those things that, like, as far as what we're doing, we're kind of getting in the trenches to get out there to help them transition, almost like a point guard, where it's like, hey, these are here, this is here, this is here. Because again, a lot of these guys don't, like, they have a piece of paper that says like there's an address here. Well, they don't even know if that address even exists anymore, because a lot of the stuff that we get behind the walls is so dated. So having a live person like, hey, we're holding a council here, hey, there's job interviews here, like, it really kind of helps ease that anxiety for people who have been gone a long time. And the last thing I'll touch on is like the toxic masculinity issues. Me and Jared have had a lot of conversations about these, and like, it is a conditioned behavior. And I had to look at myself. I'm like, where did I pick this up? And for me, it went all the way back to juvenile hall. And it was like, I was always smaller than everyone. So I was the more like, if I was more scared. So I'm like, I'm going to get off first because you're bigger than me. And if I hit you first, at least I get one in. Like, that's how I thought. So it was me acting out first, even though it maybe wouldn't even have gone there, but I was scared. So I acted out. That quickly taught me, like, if you present yourself almost like how a dog puts his hair up, like, that's what we're doing as a human to like protect ourselves, is like, you flare up. And like, you can read the physical cues of the person that you're targeting to confirm, like, okay, he doesn't want to go there, so I'm winning this argument and I'm walking away. So that conditioned behavior turned into, with everyone, officers, relationships. And I remember one time my wife, I was saying something crazy on the phone, and she's like, dude, I'm not your homeboy. And I was like, what? And she's like, yeah, I'm not your homeboy. And I was like, what does that even mean? Like, of course you're not my homeboy, you know? And like, I went back to my cell all perplexed, and I was like, dude, why would she say that? You know? And as I pondered it, it made me think, like, why am I acting as if, like, if something doesn't go my way, like, I need to like act out in aggression or say something that I shouldn't say. And then I linked like where I learned that from. And it was like, damn, when I don't get my way, I get mad. So when I get mad, I'm trying to force to get my way. And like, you're either going to submit or we're going to fight. Those are the choices. So that connection really like helped me understand why the people are the way they are inside. It's not necessarily they want to be that way. It's just a conditioned behavior that has kept them safe. And to be honest, it's kept them selfish because it works. It does. Like, you yell at people, or you, like, obviously they don't want to hang out with you anymore, but you get your way, they leave you alone. So it's stuff like that, really trying to do the work and figure out why I am the way I am. And hearing the stories from others, helping me connect with people who are not like me in my mind, but share a story who are just like me. Like, that's the stuff that really helped me ease into a place of, I always say, empathy before opinion. Like, I need to empathize with someone before I place judgment on them. But yeah, 2014, I think 2015 is, or no, maybe, I don't know. But Jerry came in and saw me, and that group, 100%, everyone is home, and there's probably 350 years of incarceration in that room, and they're all home and they're all thriving.
Thanks, Mitch. Mitch is the program manager now for Center for Cancer. Is responsible for coordinating all of our work inside prison, and we are very lucky to have him on our staff.
Yeah, thank you very much. I see that Masana Jello, I hope I'm saying your name right because I can't see you, but you had a question on chat. Can you ask it yourself? Can you, so that we don't have to read it? Can you speak up, and can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I cannot on my this thing, how to call it, my camera, because of the internet issue. But what I'm asking, like when I was doing my practicum, as a restorative justice practitioner, it was very hard for me, to be at our juvenile center. And that was the most concentrated area for my director and other personnel. And there's a school inside juvenile center. But it was very difficult, So I don't know, whether it is applied to all countries or it is only applied, for our country, or what's normally happen. Why, certain people are not allowed to visit prison, so that, they can discuss with them to make sure that, they, change the people that are being accused of doing wrong in a society. So this is a question that I was trying to raise. I don't know whether you have get me correctly or because sometimes the internet issue. Thank you.
Yeah, and just before, I just want to ask you before Jared answers, what country, where are you calling or coming in from? What country are you talking about?
I'm from the Gambia, West Africa, the Smiling Coast.
Thank you. Jared,
Right.
Please.
Yeah, I think that, thank you for that question, and thank you for your work. There are some extraordinary traditions around the world that we sometimes call restorative justice. We are using the word council because Benjamin Franklin was familiar with Latin, and when he watched the Haudenosaunee people in a circle, concilium was the word that came to mind, so he said council. But when we have traveled throughout Africa, we have found that Ibitaramo and Dare and Fambul Talk and other traditions remind us of what our people have done to create community. Ho'oponopono in Hawaii and Polynesian cultures, Diwan and Loya Jirga in Islamic traditions. It's very important to be in a practice that feels organic to the place you are. Restorative justice is a concept that is about restoring. And so in many instances, trying to bring restorative justice to a place that doesn't have an awareness of what it is to be in community where everybody is valued and everyone is connected is a real uphill battle. Certainly in schools, trying to bring restorative justice to a community that doesn't think of itself as a community, that doesn't practice counsel in the good times, is very difficult to convince folks of, and actually to have participants remember what it is we're trying to restore as we address the harm that's been done. So I think that it is very specific to where it is we're trying to bring the practice. And I will say that there is enormous resistance to new ideas for all kinds of reasons. For us, our focus has been on working within the United States, and we have recognized that we need to not only rely on this being the right thing to do, but we need evidence. We need to go in with qualitative and quantitative and now even biometric arguments around why this is an appropriate return on investment. If you're going to give me a grant and you're going to allow me into the prison, I need to show you some data on why this works. And I know that many of us here on this call may feel that that's, superfluous or unnecessary. But when we are trying to affect systems, we need to make the case that we have to be inside working with folks. And the reasons are borne out by the evidence. And I can show you on paper why this works and why it's a proper investment. And so this was part of the growth of our organization, was doing the research and amassing enough validated scales that assess criminogenic factors that shift as a result of counsel. We had to talk that language and understand that things like impulse control and the capacity for empathy and understanding what pro-social relationships look like. These are factors that folks assess criminal behavior. Criminologists use these scales. And so we learned how to speak that language and then make the case for the value of this work. And I'll just quickly say that what will get you into a prison to do a program is not the same language that will convince the police department that they need to do this with their officers, or the local school district that they need to do it for their children. You need to understand what emotional intelligence and social emotional learning is about in those situations. When we recognized how deep and pervasive the suffering is within the carceral state, it was hard for me to see that it wasn't just folks who were suffering, who were incarcerated, but the officers, despite how brutal they were being and how nasty and awful the behavior was, the suffering was deep. And understanding how ill-equipped they are to respond to the stress that they feel on a regular basis is not only making them ineffective, but it's killing them. These folks who are in law enforcement are dying 20, 22 years sooner than the general population, studies show. And it's not because they're getting shot, in the line of duty. It's because stress-related illness from the incapacity to actually manage what a super stressful life is leading to stress-related illness, like, from Alzheimer's to high blood pressure to hypertension, strokes, in addition to anxiety and depression. There's all kinds of evidence that shows that work like this gives folks the opportunity to step into a better health profile. Their heart rate variability shifts. We can prove that. Their cortisol levels, their capacity for managing stress changes. And so speaking with officers is about staying alive, being healthy, being able to enjoy your retirement. And in bringing aboard this self-awareness and self-regulation, your health is why we want you to do this work. When you learn to take care of yourself and listen to your body, that extends to your partner and your family, and ultimately to the communities and the incarcerated folks that you're there to serve. But you can't start there with those folks. You really need to start earlier. And so I think it's really important that we understand the room we're in, who we're talking to, and to speak into the listening, as Marshall Rosenberg used to say, so that we are really meeting people where they are. This is a complex process of changing systems. But in order to do that, we need to be able to make the case based on where people are and where that resistance really lies.
Jared, I wanted to point out, Lindsay Scott has a couple of questions posted in chat. Lindsay, are you comfortable unmuting and voicing your questions?
I just got to say, I'm so appreciating this. It feels really good to wander into this community and just feel the soul and the heart and the practice here. So thank you so much. I'm being really nourished. My work is maybe adjacent. I used to teach art and yoga at a juvenile detention center, where my prayer for abolition really came alive. but it's just got a fresh match underneath it. I was put together with an incarcerated musician to write a song, which I'm going to put in the chat because I hope you all hear it. It's a really beautiful song. And it's really about, I mean, it's about these connections. Like, how do we weave a community together, outside, inside, to hold this reparative work that you're talking about? And it's just like opening my world. I'm meeting so many restorative practitioners in different pockets and ways. And so people are sending me stuff. That's how I found you all. And I'm just like really enlivened by this. And the question that's arising for me is, so my friend who's incarcerated is a natural leader. He's in a phenomenal healing process. He's in Iowa. Could he start to access training for counsel? He's already doing it with, the other guys who need to do their disclosures. Like, there's a natural thing that's happening in the disclosure process. There's a natural thing that's happening in their speech class. Like he's in college inside. And so, we talk after speech class and he just downloads all the heart opening, but there's no container for it, right? Like, it's within mental pedagogy, there's not this heart-based container for it, which, as a facilitator, I'm a grief ritualist myself. I just ache for the space to really hold the medicine stories that are coming forward. And I would love to support him in just accessing more skillfulness in facilitating these spaces that are already happening. So I'm just curious. I'm like, how does he get this facilitation? Or do you guys want to come to Iowa? That's kind of how my mind is going. And I wonder if you can speak to what comes alive in that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And the sort of co-arising now is so beautiful. It really, I think, points to this sort of rhizome of, compassionate responses to suffering that is arising in all kinds of different contexts. We happen to have a little bit of, funding and access here in California. We got a bunch of grants prior to COVID to do work inside prisons, and then COVID. So a bunch of money. And we said, okay, well, no, you can't extend this. You have to use it by the end of the year. It's like, well, I don't think COVID is going to break. Well, you're going to have to give the money back to us. And I sort of thought, we're not going to give the money back to you. We need to use this. And so we thought, how can we provide services to folks when we can't actually go into a prison? How can we work with them? And we were getting letters all the time from the many prisons we work in saying, we are craving this and we don't have an opportunity to be with the folks who help us remember who we are. What do we do? And so we encourage folks to kind of write these letters to us, and we would, for each prison, compile their shares and create this sort of newsletter that went in along with some instructions on how to sit in your cell and drop in and sort of invite a counsel circle in your cell, set out some folks, kind of places for them to sit. Of course, using your imaginary kind of capacities to kind of place them in your cell, do a guided meditation, drop in, and then read each one of their shares in this newsletter. And then there was a blank piece of paper at the end where they could start writing their share. And so that everyone sent it back to us, and we compiled it again, and then we sent it back for the next round of counsel. And everybody, 25 individuals in their cells, were practicing counsel simultaneously through the mail. We did this over and over again and found it was so rewarding and compelling in ways we never imagined could be possible, sending letters back and forth. But they really had enough of a grounding to be able to hold this practice in their heart and then really have those words come alive through just the written shares. And we said to the state at that point, we need to compile a book, and we want everyone to be able to do this. And so the first thing we did was this book, which is Where Compassion Begins, a handbook for incarcerated persons. And then we said, yeah, but we also want one for the general public. So we're going to write this too. And they said, fine, use your grant funds. And so we were able to use the money that had been allocated to us to come up with both of these. But this version of the book, and these are both, again, you can get them through our website by making a donation, but you can also get them on Amazon. And it is an opportunity to be introduced to the practice of counsel. The whole first part of the book is really supporting what counsel means to you individually. And the second part of the book is to deepen the practice through activities. We worked with the wonderful Jan Chosen-Bays to look at some mindfulness on the go activities. We adjusted those so that they could be offered to folks who are in prison, and every kind of week work on a particular area of awareness, really kind of drop in, have a writing prompt, and then we offered council prompts for you to do in your council group. Then there were articles, and then for the online version, there are links to podcasts, so that we're really examining how it is we are becoming more aware of our physical existence for the first chapter, our mental existence, how our inner critic is always active, catastrophizing and horribilizing, and then our emotional regulation and how things are occurring to us in a heart space, and then finally relationally and spiritually, what's arising for us, kind of a medicine wheel kind of approach. In offering these resources, individuals have been able to really drop into the practice even when they can't practice counsel. And it's hopefully like kind of a primer. It's not something that can take the place of actual experience, but there's a great deal that individuals can do on their own. And hopefully it gives folks opportunity for when they're with their family or with their cellmate, or maybe even in a group that they can put together of 2 or 3 or 4, should have somewhere to go. These individual practice spaces that emerge arise out of a personal practice that can be reinforced. So all of this to say, we've really wanted to provide resources. Our first chapter has been about transforming the rehabilitation process in California prisons. But as we are called to different states and different countries to model this and to help folks initiate programs, we are very eager to point to this successful model and all of the research that we have and all of the data that proves that this works, and help folks initiate similar programs in other correctional systems. My hope is that others will respond in that way, but even if that doesn't happen systemically, individuals who are incarcerated or individuals who are not incarcerated are welcome to drop in and find ways to come into counsel with yourself, with the environment, with the natural world, and maybe the folks that you naturally interact with, by some suggested prompts and suggested containment for this kind of conversation in counsel. So we're working to create the resources, and we'd love for you all to kind of work with it and tell us what you think and help us understand how we can support the emergence. And my hope is that in this next chapter, we will have resources to go a lot further, to travel. I've got 62, 63 certified counsel trainers who travel all around the state of California and sometimes out of California. So we certainly have the capacity to respond when there is funding, when there are resources, and when there's interest to go beyond what we've been demonstrating here in California.
Thank you so much.
Jared, again, I encourage everybody else to put your electronic hand up if you'd like to ask questions or add ingredients to this conversation. Jared, you and I yesterday, you brought up this wonderful phrase, structures of belonging. And I was really taken by that as something that everybody needs in this society. But of course, your work and the work of your people really addresses that in certain areas like prisons, like schools, and haven't even, talked about companies and things like that. But you want to say something about the context in which this came up, structures of belonging, and why that's so critical now.
Thank you for that, Eve. There are 2 things I want to say. I do want to mention that understanding the need for correctional officers to have these resources got me really thinking about how important law enforcement is to understand with humility, cultural humility, as we move into a culture that's very different from what we're used to working in. And so navigating that was complicated, but was really critically important because of the understanding that officers are dying and getting sick. So
could you say a little bit more about that before we, because I was curious about how you even started with prison guards or police and what you encountered, and, did you encounter in some way the same patterns of resistance as with prison inmates, or was it different?
Yeah. Remarkably similar in a lot of ways. But I think, unfortunately, we are approached when an agency, a police agency, 2 suicides or 3 suicides they can deal with, but when it's like 5 or 6 folks killing themselves on the job, then they start to think, oh gosh, we need to do something. Why is this happening? Why is everyone falling apart? I went to the Officer Wellness Symposium of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and the year I went, there were 4 times as many chiefs and sheriffs who had come with this question of like, why do people tell us on the job that no one cares about them? Of course we care about them. Why are they feeling that no one cares about them? From command staff to communities, why are these officers experiencing this sense? And it seemed like a real extraordinary opening for us to start to work in that area. What does it mean to feel cared about? And how is it that you can show up in a very aggressive environment in which there's high stress and offer folks this opportunity? Part of it is understanding, the resources that are so critical, about self-awareness and about self-regulation, about understanding the autonomic nervous system and what happens when we are so triggered, what happens when we are activated and dysregulated such that our prefrontal cortex is not working. We're not able to hear and understand "I can't breathe" as words that a fellow human being is saying, because our prefrontal cortex has been overrun with this sympathetic tone because we're in this fight, flight, freeze mode. Some of you know what I'm talking about here. It's a really important thing to be able to deliver to law enforcement. And so we spoke that language of understanding what stress looks like and how it is we can have resources. And I think that the response was, this is innovative and this is valuable, but how do we sustain it? And what we kind of understood was, once you get past the sort of like folded arms and like, talk about your feelings, we're not going to do that, touchy-feely bunch of libs with their kumbaya kind of stuff, which is what we got. There was this moment where someone said, yeah, but this buddy of mine got too much for him and he killed himself. And then you see people go, mm-hmm. And someone else says, yeah, and my stomach, I've had all these problems. I can't sleep at night. People like, mm-hmm. And so the vulnerability that emerged, as Mitch described and we talked about earlier, was really about how wrecked these individuals are physically and what might be done to create resources. And once that began to happen, we realized that in the circle, there's so much care and support right there that the system is squashed, but we needed to sustain it. So we came up with an idea of huddles, because people like sports in that world. And so huddles, counsel, process, community practice, but a huddle you can understand. Everyone's got a huddle. And so a huddle that's organized with a little wallet card where you do this breathing exercise, and then you say something that you're grateful for, and then there's some prompt ideas. This was something that could be sustained. And so officers, when given the opportunity to huddle up for 45 minutes once or twice a week with 5 or 6 of their peers, loved this opportunity to show up at a place where they could say what was up for them and felt like there was a group that just was there to listen. And so the version of counsel that supported officers was called something different and presented very differently, but provided a structure in which they felt they belonged and could be heard, that they felt connected. I have to say, for anybody here who is not aware of our Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy, and his work, I urge you to check out their website. President Obama brought Vivek Murthy in, and he did some extraordinary work, and then he disappeared during the Trump years, and now he's back. President Biden appointed him again. His office has identified loneliness and isolation as the most critical epidemic of our time, and that it underlies so many health crises that we are experiencing, from opioid addiction to domestic violence to political violence to mental health, all kinds of mental health implications. And what the Surgeon General has done with his advisory that came out last week, like remember when Everett Koop came out with the smoking will kill you thing. This is like akin to that. It has huge significance. The healing effects of social connection and community are being promoted by the most high-profile medical authority of this country. And understanding that humans are wired for social connection, And we've become more isolated over time. And we need to find ways to come back to this activity of engaging and belonging, because social connection significantly improves the health and well-being of everyone, individually, collectively, and communally. And so that this is now where our sort of official policy is moving, creates opportunities for more grant funding and more ability to penetrate in policy. You know, we've been working with Vivek Murthy's deputy, and the fact that this is resonating in the zeitgeist right now is incredibly encouraging. The fact that we've identified that the sense of belonging and being connected underlies so much that's critical to our, you know, the social fabric that we rely on, is now something that we're really leaning into. And if we can suggest that folks practice counsel and integrate counsel into their schools and their prisons and their organizations, law enforcement, their businesses, we can demonstrate the impact of creating structures of belonging on the individual and the collective health of the nation. I'm thrilled about that being echoed on so many different levels now. And so, yeah, he also wrote this great book called Together, which is the book that was written during the Trump years by this office that got kind of thrown out and had to figure out some way to make this case. But fortunately, he's now back and speaking this language. And I think it's really beginning to shift the thinking of a lot of folks. And that's really where we want to be. We want to really identify this practice of counsel as one that supports returning this incredibly important resource of social connection and belonging to our day-to-day, individually, but also in the structures in which we work and live.
Again, we're getting a little bit close to the end, but there's plenty of time still for asking questions and adding comments. So I encourage you to do that before we end. What comes up for me, Jared, is that given what you were just saying, you know, even those of us who are not in prison very often feel really disconnected, even from the people very close to us, for different reasons. You know, we're not in prison, so distance isn't the issue, or separation, but we're just like following our lives and we're filling it up. And I don't have to tell you, with all kinds of things, and people right in our house, sometimes we're not connected with, you know, it's like we're too much in a rush to really have community, even in our own home. That's what is so odd for those of us who are not in prison. And I wonder what if you've seen that, and what do you think about it?
It seems, again, like such a simple shift, and it's so difficult for so many of us to just sit and listen, you know, and listening attentively and speaking authentically, remaining curious and offering regard is such a nourishment in every relationship. And we so quickly lose that sort of understanding of what we need as humans. But it requires, you know, letting go of the need to control and to fix and to rescue and to, you know, follow our agenda. It requires truly practicing, showing up and understanding that showing up with this not knowing quality and the commitment and the vow to bear witness is incredibly generative. It is what makes us relational. It's what creates the opportunity for us to see one another, to be resources to one another. And that relationality is at the core of restoring community, whether it's in our family or it's in our schools or wherever. I think that what is often really missed is that this idea of vulnerability sounds scary, and it can be scary, and we certainly can appreciate that. But, you know, there is no, as Brene Brown says, you know, there's no act of courage without vulnerability. Vulnerability is a quality that must be something that we encourage and teach. And vulnerability leads to trust, not the other way around. You don't wait until you trust people and then you get vulnerable. It is appropriate and skillful vulnerability and the invitation to tell something about yourself that maybe you have kept back a bit, that creates this environment of psychological safety in which we feel like we can begin to trust one another. And that capacity to work with vulnerability is what practices like counsel encourage us to find over and over again. You know, it is a simple as Roshi Jones says, as sitting with a strong back and a soft front. We have to be able to show up and be permeable. And that's not something that we are used to doing with other people. We're used to doing on the cushion, perhaps, and opening ourselves in a way that seems less threatening. But to be with others in such a way that listening to them, is something that goes through us and into us. The aperture through which we sort of see people that gets tightened when we make judgments about them, so that that's who you are. You're this person. You're of this class. You're of this gender. I've squeezed you into a box now, and so anything you have to say is going to come through that very tight lens. When we let that go and truly show up in this kind of practice, we really surprise ourselves, and we become this sort of vehicle for caring, for loving, for connecting. It has such an extraordinary impact, and I'm so grateful for prison after prison, full of folks who have had the courage to show up and prove over and over again, as Mitch describes, that this is transformational. This practice is extraordinarily powerful, and it works. And it works in changing people's lives in the most extreme situations. But as you've said, Eve, a number of times, we really constrict ourselves and reduce ourselves through this series of, tightly held beliefs and judgments that is akin to being in a sort of prison of our own making. And the practices like counsel that allow us to, embody letting go of all that and finding out, what is really alive in this moment. Having your regard permit me to be with what is arising, so that I can speak something that maybe is not expected, but is there and fresh and alive, and it's okay for me to say. You won't judge me, you won't interrupt me. That's an amazing gift you give me, and that I can actually be with you and hear all of you say things that maybe I wouldn't have really heard if I didn't take the time to slow down and open up and listen, as Big Ed says, is really extraordinary, because I might have put you in a little box prior to this, and I'm not. I think this is incredibly valuable, and everybody who's found it as a practice or has learned about it through a sangha, I think is equipped with some ingredients that can be so beneficial in so many ways. And those of you who are interested in doing social justice work and being out in the world, there are folks who are invisible and whose voices have been shut down, who are so empowered by the gift of showing up to a council and a sense of belonging to a place where they are valued. That's an extraordinary thing. And in our own lives, as we have reduced ourselves in our intimate relationships and with our family groups, we've also limited how we can grow together. So I think what a beautiful opportunity it is to lean into this practice and to see that just our very practice of counsel and of presence is such a healing gesture for us, and has the capacity to really create a world that we want to leave for the next ones, a world in which compassion can arise with much more ease than the world in which we're living now, where we're really increasingly finding ourselves in these little silos of us and them. The social media and various kind of political discourse has kind of really got us worked up into thinking, well, whether you're watching Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson, you're still getting fed your confirmation bias of this is what's right, and those people over there are just impossible. This whole sense of the binary of us and them is really problematic in a lot of ways. I mean, it feeds us, but it also is problematic. And the next chapter of our organization is the launch of something called Beyond Us and Them. And beyond us and them is what happens when we allow ourselves to show up in this kind of way, and imagine that field, Rumi's field, in which right doing and wrongdoing, are invited. That place where we can lie down in that grass, and the world is too full to talk about, as he says. We are really feeling that this is the time to be talking about these things and to be aspirational about that place in which we no longer see each other as us's and them's.
Jared, this sounds so fantastic and so visionary. I'm sure there are some of us here on the screen who really, so first, how do we find out more? There's already cues about, right. Cues about how to get the book and all that, but how to support this work, how to join it. What do you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful to show up, and I think Lindsay's still here. I appreciate so much just being able to be in the company of these stories and to listen. I'm glad Mitch was able to be here and share some of his incredible journey. We maintain communication with those who want to be part of this conversation. Centerforcounsel.org has so many stories of people like Mitch and others, and I would urge you to check that out. If you're interested in looking at what Beyond Us and Them looks like, go to that as well. So centerforcounsel.org and beyondusandthem.org are where we do our work. The more folks who join in, the more people who want to support this, whether through their own individual practice or supporting the organization, make it possible for this to move into the world in a more robust way. Those are the two areas, and there you'll find so much that's on YouTube and on social media. And when we are able to invite folks into a direct experience, we do. We offer counsel trainings in California, but we also offer them around the world for folks who are interested in bringing a counsel training to their local area. I see Niamh in the corner here, and we just were invited to go to Dublin and spend a wonderful time offering a counsel training to a group of folks, mostly mindfulness teachers in Dublin. We are really eager to be with you in this practice and to encourage you along. And we've got resources like the book, but there's nothing like experiencing 2 days of really immersion in the practice of counsel. And then use our research, use what we've been able to prove in our arguments about why this is important as you are changing systems and you are approaching folks about the value of this. Use this and ally with us and reach out. And I'm always available to be in conversation with you if you have interest, if you have needs, or if you see ways to support this work. I'd be eager to talk to you.
I see there's a question from Asana Jello again. Do you help organizations establish counseling in schools, which I know you do, but rather than, I know we're almost at the end, but I would just encourage everyone to contact the Center for Counsel, am I right, with any questions or inquiries about what can be done?
Absolutely. And again, we're a nonprofit organization, so my job is to go find resources. We obviously don't have any to begin with, but the more we talk to folks, the more we have people like the Surgeon General out there, messaging this, the more I can find foundations and donors and others, the more we can do. And we can certainly encourage you along. We can't really come up with resources that we don't have, but we're out there trying to get folks to understand the importance of this, and whatever we can offer, we'd love to for you. We'd love to be in conversation with you, and we have such gratitude for all the work you do. Maybe it looks like counsel, maybe you have other names for it and it looks differently, but how beautiful it is to be bringing this work out into the world. And we encourage you, we appreciate you, and we'd love to do what we can to ally with you.
And again, the Center for Counsel, you could find it easily on the website. You can, on Google or anything else, they have a very wonderful website. Okay, Jared.
I want to thank.
Go ahead, Jeff. Yeah, you take over now.
I'm the door closer, I think, aren't I? Yeah. I want to thank both Eve and Jared for such a rich conversation. Thank you. Wonderful to share this. And I want to thank all 20 plus of you who stayed with us for the hour and a half. And my hope is that everybody takes away something. I want to leave you with just a couple of things. Be sure to go to the Zen Peacemaker website and sign up for our newsletter if you haven't done so already. And you can get notification of events like this that we do coming up in the future. I will say, not so much in terms of counsel training, but in terms of participating in counsel, we offer counsel on a regular basis. In fact, my friend Kathleen from Germany is here, and I, at least once a month, maybe more, Kathleen and others offer a women's only council on Fridays that's open to everybody. So join that if you'd like. And then we have once a month we have a council for mental health workers, and then we offer counsel, more broadly for anyone. So, and those will come up on the schedule. So you're welcome to join us for any of those, and really, to have that experience of being in counsel. And as Jared and I were talking earlier, it really is transformative. And so I welcome that.